It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Barry Strauss to the Mackinder Forum. Professor Strauss will be talking about Jews versus Rome, 2 centuries of rebellion against the world's mightiest empire. Professor Strauss is the Corliss Dean Page Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution and Bryce and Edith M. Bomar Professor in Humanistic Studies Emeritus at Cornell University. He specializes in military and naval history with an emphasis on the ancient world and its legacy. Professor Strauss is also series editor of Princeton's Turning Points in Ancient History and an author of many best-selling and extraordinarily important books, including Masters of Command, Alexander, Hannibal, Caesar, and the Genius of Leadership, The Trojan War, The Battle of Salamis, Death of Caesar, 10 Caesars, The War That Made the Roman Empire, and most recently, Jews versus Rome, 2 centuries of rebellion against the world's mightiest empire. And with that, Professor Strauss, please begin.
Thank you, Len. Thank you, everyone, for your introductions. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here today to have a chance to speak to you. As Len says, this is the subject of my most recent book, which was published in August. And I'd like to make some remarks about it, introducing you to the subject. And I want to focus on what was the reason that I wrote this book in the first place, which was the international situation. I think that we all have some familiarity with the subject of ancient Israel, that is Judea, as it was then called, in the first century of our era. It's famous, first of all, because of Jesus Christ, who lived there and then. Also, probably most of us have heard of Masada. Most people have heard of Masada, which also took place in that era. And it's the time of what is known to us through Josephus, primarily the Jewish War, as his book is called, or the Great Revolt of Jews against Rome. But I want to set the story in a wider framework, an international framework, a geopolitical framework that I hope might be of particular interest to the Mackinder Forum, because it was certainly what was of interest to me when I began my project in around 2020, so well before October 7th, 2023. And what got me interested in the subject was what I'll call the Iranian connection, the role of ancient Iran, the Parthian Empire, Parthia, as it was known at the time, in the struggles between the Jews and Rome. So that's where I started, and that's what I want to focus on today. So here we see a map of the Roman Empire, Imperium Romanum, in the years 68 and 69. For the map maker, the focus was the fact that this was the time of the year of the 4 emperors, so-called, 69, in which there was a series of civil wars in Rome. In 68, Nero was forced off the throne. He committed suicide, and he's replaced first by Galba, then by Otho, then by Vitellius, and then by Vespasian, as you can see in the legend on the bottom left of the map. But it's also the time of the Great Revolt. And you can see the Roman Empire in this period stretches from central England, central northern England here in the west, all the way eastward to Syria, to what was then called Cappadocia, so let us call it Central Eastern Turkey, to Egypt, and finally to Judea, which you can see over here with Jerusalem. And that is the time of the revolt. To the east of the Roman Empire stood Rome's only remaining imperial rival, and that was the Parthian Empire, which you can see on this map. So where the Roman Empire ends at the Euphrates River and in the rugged territory of eastern Turkey, That's where the Parthian Empire begins, and in the desert here, in the Syrian-Iraqi border, that's where the Parthian Empire begins, and it stretches all the way eastward to the boundaries of uh, Pakistan and India and Afghanistan, where it meets another empire, the Kushan Empire over here, and the Han Dynasty further east. Parthian Empire is one that is usually not the focus of our attention for those of us who are historians of ancient Greece and Rome. More is the pity, because tremendously important subject. It's around for several centuries. It is one of a series of Iranian empires in the ancient world. Probably the most famous is the Achaemenid Persian Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE. And it is succeeded in turn by the Sasanian Empire, another Iranian empire, an even more powerful one and more dangerous to Rome, and then to the Byzantine Empire, than was the Parthian Empire. Parthian Empire sits astride the trade routes to the east, making it very wealthy. The Parthians are great soldiers. They're particularly good at cavalry, at equestrian warfare, and from time to time they invade the Roman Empire, and they are invaded more often by the Romans themselves. So they're a threat, and they are loom very large in the Roman imagination. And if there's one point I want to make, and one thing that struck me in my research was, from the Roman point of view, Judea, I'll go back to the previous map, Judea is a small place on the edge of empire. When the Romans think about Judea, they are looking over it, in effect, to the main event. And the main event is Parthia and the Parthian Empire. And to the extent that Judea is important to them, one of the reasons it's important is because its relationship with the Parthian Empire. And as we'll see, Judea has a distinct relationship with the Parthian Empire, and the Romans had every reason to suspect the loyalty of Judea, and perhaps of Jews more generally in the Roman Empire, given its past history with the Parthian Empire. So, here is Judea at the height of its greatest extent under Herod. Herod was the king, the famous and infamous king, infamous both in Jewish and Christian traditions, who ruled over Judea from 37 BCE to his death in 4 BCE. And how he became king of Judea, well, thereby hangs a tale. So to just give a brief overview, Judea became independent in the 2nd century BCE because of the famous Maccabean revolt that ended up establishing a dynasty on the throne, the so-called Hasmonean dynasty. And under that dynasty, the kingdom extended its rule roughly to the area you see on the map. It covers much of modern Israel, though not all of it. It includes the West Bank. It includes part of Western Jordan here, and it extends into Lebanon and Syria over here. It's the small parts of Lebanon and Syria. Here's Damascus. Here's Tyre. Here roughly is Haifa, so you can see that's not part of the kingdom. And here is Jerusalem, and here is Amman, Jordan, over here. You get some sense of where it was. So in 63 BCE, the Romans conquered first Syria, and then they were on the border of Judea, and they were invited into Judea because of a civil war between two pretenders, two claimants to the throne of the Hasmoneans. They both went to see the Roman general in Syria, who was Pompey, and they each vied for his support. Pompey decided to choose the weaker of the two in his eyes, and he was invited southward into Judea. and he went to Jerusalem. There his enemies holed up in the temple, on the Temple Mount, above the city. And after a siege of several months, Pompey took the temple, slaughtered a lot of people, entered the Holy of Holies to the horror of any believing Jew, claims he took nothing with him, even though the temple is rather wealthy, and then rearranged things in Judea to cut down its territory in size, to demote the king to the title of tetrarch, a local ruler, and to make sure that Judea was now firmly under the throne of Rome. I should say at the outset that Judea was not ethnically a simple place or a monolithic place. There was a large and Jewish population, the dominant population under the Hasmoneans, but there are several non-Jewish minorities. First of all, the Samaritans, who lived, of course, in Samaria, also called Samaritans. They accepted the Torah, but they did not accept Jerusalem as their religious center, nor did they accept the temple in Jerusalem, but rather they had their own temple on Mount Gerizim near the modern Nablus. There were a series of cities dominated by Greek speakers. Some of them were on the coast, such as Ascalon and Gaza, or Ptolemies. And then here inland, places like Hippos, Gadara, Scythopolis, Beit Shean in Hebrew, Pella, and these cities known as the Decapolis, the 10 cities. There were Jews living there, but Greek majorities in general, they were not all that happy with the Greek Jewish overlords either. There were groups of Arabs living in the north in a place like Iturea here, also in the south. There were the Idumeans, who originally had lived in Edom, so on the east side of the Dead Sea, but centuries earlier had migrated westward. They had converted to Judaism in the 2nd century BCE. And they were not opposed to rule from Jerusalem. So a series of different groups, and Pompey, in classic Roman fashion, played the game of divide and conquer. He liberated some of the Greek cities from Jewish rule, and they rewarded him by starting their calendars in the year 63 BCE on their coins to mark their liberation from Jewish overlordship. Well, Pompey left, and about a generation later, in the year 40 BCE, enter the Parthians, enter the Iranians. The faction that had lost under Pompey always looked towards Parthia to restore their fortunes. Centuries earlier, as you undoubtedly know, Cyrus the Great had liberated the Jewish exiles in Babylon during the Babylonian captivity and had allowed them to return to Judea to rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And ever since then, there had been warm relations between the Jews of Judea and the Persian, the Iranian rulers. In addition, there were large numbers of Jews living under Parthian rule, under first Persian rule, and then ultimately Parthian rule, mostly in what is now Iraq, particularly in southern Iraq, the area around modern Baghdad, what the Jews at the time called Babylon. And so warm relations between these two groups and constant cross-fertilization, people going back and forth across the border. And so the faction that had lost called in the Parthians. And in the year 40 BCE, they got their wish. The Parthians invaded the Roman Empire. They invaded Syria. They conquered it. They conquered part of southern Anatolia. And they invaded and conquered Judea and put their candidate on the throne. They drove out and ultimately killed the Roman king, the pro-Roman king, and put a pro-Parthian king on the throne. Enter Herod, who fled, went to Rome, was anointed king, not literally anointed, excuse me, was made king, named king of Judea by the Roman Senate, the most unusual way of choosing a king of Israel that we know of. And he made his way back to Judea, where over the next 3 years, with considerable Roman help and over a lot of hard fighting, he established his control of Judea. The Parthians were driven out. The Parthian prince who had led these wars was killed in battle in Syria. His name is Pacorus. And Judea was now loyal to Rome again and under Herod, who turned out to be one of the most pro-Roman, loyal rulers that the Romans had in their entire empire. So very close and important relationship between the two. And when Herod died in the year 4 BCE, Herod, unfortunately, was at war with his sons. He had many sons, many wives, many sons, and he killed off the most competent of the sons because he thought they might be a threat to his control of the kingdom, which they probably were. And so at his death, he is left with some not so competent sons. And the Roman emperor, now Augustus, the first Roman emperor, decides he's not all that impressed by any of them. So he divides the kingdom in three. The main part of the kingdom comes under the rule of Archelaus, one of Herod's sons. Galilee and Perea come under the rule of Antipas. And then this area, the Golan, part of Lebanon and Syria, come under the rule of a man named Philip, the third of the sons. When Herod dies, there is a rebellion against Rome, and it is put down rapidly and brutally by the Roman governor of Syria. It ends with 2,000 rebels being crucified around Jerusalem, pour encourager les autres, as Voltaire would later say, to encourage the others, to make a point. It doesn't go well. Archelaus turns out to be a weak ruler, not really up to snuff, and in the year 6 CE, 6 AD, Augustus fires him, sends him off to retirement in the south of France, not bad, and he makes Judea a Roman province. The two kings, or princes we really should say, the other sons of Herod remain in place here in these two other regions. But the central area, including Jerusalem, are now a Roman province. And the province is governed from a city that Herod had built, Caesarea Maritima, Caesar city by the sea. That's where the governor sat, and that's where Herod had built the city to be a great port, an artificial harbor, really very impressive engineering for the ancient world. Meant to rival Alexandria, never quite reached that point, Alexandria, Egypt, but still a very significant harbor and a city that looked Roman for all intents and purposes, although it had a Jewish minority, crowned by a temple to Augustus, one of 3 temples to Augustus that Herod built in his kingdom. Okay, so here's the province of Judea. Here you can see Caesarea, which is the Roman capital. The Jewish capital, from the point of view of Jews, was here in Jerusalem. Here's the Galanitis, and to the east, Nabatean Arabia, ruled by an Arab king. This is the province, this is Judea and its territory as it was at the time of Christ, well known to us from the New Testament. And it's an area that is constantly on the low boil, constantly simmering with revolts, rebels. This is the great age of apocalypse in Jewish and then Christian history. The idea that the world was going, as we know it, was going to come to an end, and that redemption was at hand, the kingdom of God was at hand, and that a redeemer, the Messiah, the anointed one, a descendant of King David, would arise and usher in the new era. And there were variant claimants for this crown, or people who were recognized as claimants for the crown, such as Jesus. Jesus, just very briefly, was not a violent rebel against Rome. Rather, he preached spiritual redemption and spiritual resistance rather than violent resistance. But there were those who preached violent resistance. In that sense, Judea was not unusual. There were a series of rebellions around the Roman Empire from Britain, Germany, Gaul, Dalmatia, so Croatia and part of Serbia, Algeria and Morocco. There were rebellions there as well. The only thing that made Judea different was the two things, really. One, the Parthian threat, the fact that the rebels might be in cahoots with the Parthians, and two, the Jewish diaspora, the fact that there were Jews not just to the east, but also to the west. I think the next slide will help. Yes, okay. So here is a slide that shows us evidence of Jewish synagogues in the Roman Empire. And you can see that there's a large Jewish population in Egypt. Indeed, Alexandria is probably the largest Jewish city in terms of population in the ancient world at this time. Quite a few in what's now Turkey and Greece, and here in northeastern Libya, very important. Ultimately, Rome and its port of Ostia. It's reckoned that the Jewish population in the diaspora, particularly when you include Parthia as well, was larger than the Jewish population of Judea. Here you can see this map, not quite as user-friendly, shows the various places to which the Jews had migrated, either voluntarily or involuntarily. Either they'd gone in search of fortune or a better life, or they had been sent as slaves or prisoners of war. And they include Babylon here, and here in the north under the Assyrians, Nineveh, and what's today Iraqi Kurdistan. I'm not really sure what Gozan is, to be perfectly honest, but various areas. So all of this is in the minds of the Romans when they say, why would these rebellions be different than anywhere else? The rebels, yeah, I'll talk about that in a moment. The rebels didn't have that much, they didn't have that much traction in Judea. They never were a majority. They never were in a position after the year 6 to start a rebellion, a large-scale rebellion in Judea. It seems clear that most people either had their heads down and grudgingly accepted the Romans, or were active collaborators with the Romans, as many of the wealthier people were in Judea, many of the wealthier Jews were, and particularly the priests in Jerusalem. They got along with the Romans as the wealthy elites did throughout the Roman Empire. Not particularly unusual. The only thing that's unusual is that there were fewer members of the elite in Judea who were willing to play the Roman game than elsewhere. And playing the Roman game meant investing in public buildings, using private money to build public buildings, and also fighting in the Roman army, serving in command under the Romans, going to Rome, educating your children in Rome. Members of Herod's family did all of those things, and as we'll see, there were a few elsewhere in the Roman Empire who did, but by and large, the priests of Jerusalem were not going to play that game. They had a different view of what the world was all about. Still, all in all, it worked pretty well. That is to say, these collaborators, maybe that's the wrong word since it's a loaded word, those who worked with the Roman, co-workers with the Romans, pretty much kept a lid on things in Judea for the Romans, except for minor outbreaks of resistance, which the Romans easily put down with one hand tied behind their back. Now, another important player in all this is a vassal kingdom, a client kingdom of the Parthian Empire. Parthia was a rather loose empire, and Rome too in its ways was relatively loose in this period. The kingdom of Adiabene, roughly modern Iraqi Kurdistan, with its capital at Arbela, modern Erbil, the ruling dynasty of Adiabene in the first century converted to Judaism. Why they did that is not entirely clear, partly because of missionary activity by Jewish sages and scholars, and partly because they might have found it convenient to have a foothold on the Mediterranean, so to speak, by having their man in Jerusalem. In any case, the dynasty, the dowager queen of the dynasty, a woman named Helena, after she turned the throne over to one of her sons, moved to Jerusalem, built a palace in Jerusalem on the Ophel, so south of the Temple Mount, and spent a number of years there studying with Jewish religious teachers and also becoming beloved to the population because at a time of famine in the 40s CE, she arranged for food to be brought from outside of Judea to feed the starving people. Later in life, she went back to Adiabene, but she arranged that for when she died, that she would be buried in Jerusalem, as she was. Her bones were brought to Jerusalem. And then two of her sons, each of whom ruled in succession, were also buried in Jerusalem. The tomb still stands, or part of it still stands. It's called the Tomb of the Kings, and you can visit it in East Jerusalem today, as I did. But if you want to do that, beware. The Tomb of the Kings is property of La République Française, and you actually have to apply to the French consulate in Jerusalem to be admitted to it, but it's really worth seeing. What's interesting and important is they kept up this connection. And while Herod and his successors sent their children to Rome to be educated, Helena and her successors sent their children to Jerusalem to be educated. And at the time of the Great Revolt in the 60s, members of the royal dynasty, probably Helena's grandsons, were there fighting on the side of the rebels. Okay, so we're back to the Roman Empire in the 60s. Nero is emperor. And this is bad news for the people of Judea. For one thing, Nero needs money because for a variety of reasons, not least because he had decided to rebuild Rome after the Great Fire of 64. Another reason it's bad is that Nero doesn't much sympathize with Jews. He prefers the Greeks. He's a great Philhellene. And he appoints governors of Judea whose remit is basically to squeeze the locals until the pips squeak, to favor the Greeks as opposed to the Jews. The most notorious of these governors was a man named Florus. And under Florus, first of all, there's anti-Jewish violence in Caesarea. Florus favors the Greeks. The Jewish community there pays him a very hefty bribe to get his help. He pockets the money and then turns on his heels and says, sorry, nothing I can do for you. There are demonstrations, peaceful protests against him in Jerusalem, and he sends in the troops to massacre civilians. Temperatures are rising, and at this point in the year 66, an unexpected thing happens. The younger generation of the priesthood in Jerusalem decides that it is ready to break with Rome. Unlike its fathers, generation of its fathers had always been pro-Roman, they see an opening. I should also say they see an opening because Rome has suffered a series of setbacks. There was a revolt against Nero in the West, which Nero puts down, but he's shaky on the throne. And Rome suffers a defeat in the East against the Parthians and is forced to accept the brother of the Parthian king on the throne of Armenia. In antiquity, Armenia was a bigger place than it is today, a more powerful and significant place strategically. And although Nero tried to put lipstick on this particular pig, it was clear to anyone in the know that the Parthians had won a victory over Rome in the East. All of which encouraged these brash young men in Jerusalem to revolt. And they signaled their revolt in two ways, really. First of all, they ruled that non-Jews can no longer sponsor sacrifices at the temple. That was a direct attack on Rome because Herod had made an arrangement with Augustus. Herod would have loved it dearly if the Jews could have worshipped Augustus in the temple, but he knew that would never fly, obviously. And so instead, what he arranged was that there'd be daily sacrifices at the temple on behalf of the Roman Emperor Augustus, and that these sacrifices would be sponsored and paid for by Augustus himself and the emperors who succeeded him. And so it was. Daily sacrifices on behalf of the emperor at the temple in Jerusalem. Now that comes to an end. It's a way of signaling no more Romans. And as if that wasn't bad enough, shortly afterwards, the rebels massacre the Roman garrison of Jerusalem. It is now clear to one and all that Judea is in revolt. The governor of Syria intervenes. Okay, here we have just another map with, you can see the Parthian Empire and you can see Judea. Okay, the governor of Syria intervenes. He comes south with a legion and allies, about 30,000 men, and he tries to intimidate the rebels into giving up, but they are not able to be intimidated. They're not intimidated, and the governor, an older man named Kestius, heads back towards Syria with his tail between his legs, but he has to pass through these rugged hills here, and in the way, his army is ambushed by rebels, and they massacre the better part of a legion. This is probably the worst defeat that the Romans have faced since the destruction of 3 legions under Arminius and the Germans in Teutoburger Wood in the year 9. And Nero might have been a decadent, but he wasn't a weakling or a fool, and he knew that Rome could not tolerate this kind of a revolt. So he arranged for a competent, but he felt politically unthreatening general, a man named Vespasian, to lead a new expedition against the rebels in Judea, which he did in the year 67. Vespasian had an army of about 60,000 men. They marched south. They land here from Ptolemies. And in 67, they direct their fire against Galilee here in the north. And there are a series of battles there, in particular here at a small city called Jotapata in the summer of 67, which is interesting because the defender of Jotapata was a heretofore obscure priest who had been pro-Roman and then joined the rebels and led the defense of Jotapata for about 6 weeks in the summer of 67 before the Romans overwhelmed the town, and he escapes with his life, which is in and of itself a tale. His name is Josephus. He now defects to the Romans, and he saves his skin by prophesying to the Roman general Vespasian that he will be destined to become emperor. This doesn't seem very likely to Vespasian or to anyone else, because Vespasian is not a member of the Roman nobility. He comes from a middle-class family from the Sabine country north of Rome, which Roman aristocrats would have sneered at, which is the reason why Nero thinks he's safe to be general. But Vespasian is impressed, and he, instead of shipping Josephus off to Nero in Rome and a certain torture and death, he allows Josephus to stay with the army in chains. And there are other campaigns in 67. Here in the north, he takes the city of Gamla, which is rebelling against the king of the north, who is a descendant of Herod, the grandson of Herod. His name is Agrippa II, and his capital is over here at Caesarea Philippi. Okay, so in the next year, 68, Vespasian continues his campaign. Rebels who had escaped from the campaign in the north had all headed to Jerusalem. And Vespasian is slowly tying a knot around Jerusalem and squeezing it. That's his strategy, hoping he can convince the rebels in Jerusalem to surrender. Jerusalem is an extremely well-fortified city. and laying siege to it would not be a walk in the park. But it doesn't happen because there's a revolt in Rome. Nero is forced to abdicate and flee and commit suicide. And as I mentioned earlier, we have the year of 4 emperors, ending with Vespasian himself becoming the emperor, the last man standing, the ruler of Rome. Josephus is proven to be correct. His prophecy comes true, and he is freed from his chains, and he now becomes an advisor to the Roman army. What's interesting is not just what the rebels do, but what the rebels don't do. After their successful campaign of ambushing the Roman legion in the year 60, at the beginning of the revolt, I think in the autumn of 66, they do not continue these irregular tactics. In fact, for the rest of the war, they're standing behind their walls until the siege of Jerusalem in 70. In part, it's because they overplayed their hand and tried to conquer Ascalon using more or less regular tactics, and there they failed. And they were beaten pretty badly there. In part, well, I don't know why, but it's interesting and very significant that they don't engage in irregular tactics, which some people might have thought was their best hope militarily. Going beyond that, surely their best hope was to bring in the Parthians. And our main source for the war, as I said, is Josephus. Josephus is now on the side of the Romans, and he ends up after the war moving to Rome and living there for the rest of his life in exile for another 20, 25 years or so after the war. And in his book, which we call The Jewish War, he tells us on several times that the rebels really tried to get help from Parthia. They understood that the Parthians were going to play the role, had the potential to play the role in this revolt that the French did in the American War of Independence, the American Revolution, the American War against Great Britain. In other words, they could have tipped the balance on the side of the rebels. But it didn't happen. Why not? Was it for want of trying on the part of the rebels? I hope not. I would think not. We don't really know because we don't have their version of the story. Josephus is writing a book that is meant to justify the Jews in the eyes of the Roman Empire. So he's going to downplay what they did. We know that they had some help from Adiabene. We know that members of the Adiabenian royal family are in Jerusalem, fighting to the end. We know that there are other people from Adiabene there, maybe a couple of hundred at most. We just don't know. The Parthian king is a man named Vologases I. And Vologases I, interesting, very impressive, powerful ruler. He's won this victory over Rome in Armenia. He's not particularly looking for new trouble with Rome. He's got his eastern border to worry about, where there is the Kushan Empire, which is pressing up against the east. There are barbarian tribes from the north, the Alans. Parthia, like Germany in the late 19th, early 20th century, is surrounded by potential enemies. And one could easily imagine the Emperor of Parthia saying, I don't need new headaches. I don't need to start a new war in Judea. On top of that, he might also have asked himself, is it really in my interest to have an independent Jewish state in Judea? There's a large Jewish population in the Parthian Empire. Oops, my chair just went down. Large Jewish population in the Parthian Empire, and not at all clear. And that population also has a military tradition. Not at all clear that for Parthia it'd be a good thing to have them roiled up by an independent Jewish state. So the king of Parthia declines. Independent Jews under the Parthian Empire do not come in large numbers to help the rebels. In fact, the king of Parthia offers Vespasian 40,000 cavalrymen to help put down the revolt. That is not exactly a gesture of helping the rebels. Imagine if the French had offered King George to help put down the rebellion in North America. Vespasian says thanks, but no thanks. He recognizes that this is kind of an insult, and the last thing he wants is Parthian troops in Judea again. So, just to continue briefly. Oh, here is the campaign in the north, the route that Vespasian took in 67. Not the world's most useful map. We don't have time to go in detail over what he did, but it was pretty thorough. And here you can see some of the sites of the rebellion. In the year 70, it comes down to a siege of Jerusalem, which is the rebel stronghold. This map, which is in Italian. And by the way, my maps, I took them all from the internet, and I only used things that were not under copyright. So might not in every case have been the most ideal map, but I think they get the job done. And Jerusalem was very, very well fortified. It was impregnable on three sides. Only in the north was there any hope of breaking through. The rebels fortified the wall in the north. The Romans had not allowed the Jews, when it was an independent kingdom, to fortify the northern part of the city very well because they were concerned about potential rebellions. And the Romans turned out to be very wise because the fortifications that the rebels built were not up to snuff. They didn't have the time or the resources to build truly good fortifications. They gave the Romans a run for their money, and they engaged in a series of raids, attacks, sorties from the city that did a lot of damage to the Roman army. The rebels had a chance, I think. They might have had a chance. They were there in significant numbers. There are probably about 25,000 rebel fighters in Jerusalem. The Romans have 60,000 men. If you need to have a superiority of 3-1 to have a successful siege, that's cutting it close for the Romans. The rebels also have lots of food, and they have a supply of water with a spring, which gives them water. The Romans don't have water. They have to bring water from far away. The problem that the rebels have is the rebels. They're totally divided among different factions. And in the period between 68, when there's a halt in the war, and 70, when the siege comes, the rebels' main activity is killing each other. And there's a civil war going on. And to cap it all off, they burn the food supply in Jerusalem. Political scientists talk about credible commitment, the idea that you do something from which there's a point of no return. And this was a point of no return. If you're willing to stay in a city that doesn't have much food, that shows you're committed to the rebellion. But obviously, it's not going to work. There's a famine. And to my not very great surprise, within 5 months, the Romans take the city. It's very hard fighting. The rebels fight very hard. And the Romans suffer very big losses. We don't know how many Romans were killed because the sources don't tell us how many Romans were killed, which makes me even more suspicious that a lot of Romans were killed in taking this city. But Titus, Vespasian's son, is determined to win. And although he's not very experienced, his chief of staff is. His chief of staff is a man named Tiberius Julius Alexander, the governor of Egypt, who, among other things, was a Jew, which is a story in and of itself. But the city falls in the year 70, and the temple is destroyed, and the city is destroyed, and it is left in ruins. Josephus says that 97,000 slaves, Jewish slaves, were deported. The 97,000 men were enslaved, men, women, and children, excuse me, were enslaved and deported. Josephus's numbers are often exaggerated, but this one might be accurate because the Romans did keep count of the number of slaves, and slaves were property and valuable property at that. Judea now is elevated in its rank as a Roman province. It has a Roman governor of senatorial rank, which it had not had before, and it now has a legion, which camps in the ruins of Jerusalem. Previously, it only had auxiliary, which is to say native troops, who were keeping the peace. That might have been the end of the story. The Romans hoped it was the end of the story. They hoped they were not going to have any more problems with this province, but they were nervous. They were nervous because they knew that if they had succeeded at this point, it didn't mean they would succeed forever. The Parthians were still there, and there were Jews all over the Eastern Roman Empire and in Rome itself. So Vespasian did something unusual. He imposed an unprecedented tax, the fiscus Judaicus, the Jew tax, on all Jews throughout the Roman Empire. Previously, Jews were expected to make an annual contribution to the temple in Jerusalem. The temple no longer stands. Vespasian says, you're now going to make a contribution to Rome, and not just to Rome, but to the chief god of Rome, to Jupiter of the Capitoline Hill. It's humiliating to prosperous Jews. It's not very much money. To the poor, it's also a financial burden. And it's serious business. It lasts for centuries. This tax does not go away. It's one of the reasons, I think, why these revolts were not over. Now, Judea remained a place. Jerusalem was in ruins, and many Jews had been killed or enslaved in the revolts. But Judea remains a place with a large Jewish population. They're hoping to rebuild. They're looking to rebuild, and they want to rebuild the temple. When the Jews had been exiled earlier, after the destruction of the temple and conquest of Judea by the Neo-Babylonians in the 6th century BCE, there had been a prophecy that the temple would be rebuilt within 70 years. And indeed, it was rebuilt within 70 years. And so now Jews are looking for the rebuilding of the temple 70 years afterwards. But it's not looking good. The Romans had no interest in doing this. I think that Jews around the Roman Empire, there are no public opinion polls. We don't know what they're thinking, but the results of scholarship about what we know about Jewish literature, both in Judea and the diaspora in this period, would suggest that as in the earlier period, Jewish populations were divided. Some of them wanted to keep their heads down. Some of them were pro-Roman enthusiasts of the empire. And some of them were itching for revolt against the Roman Empire. And they get their opportunity in the year 116. Why? In the year 115, the Roman emperor, Trajan, a famous Roman emperor, begins a ambitious invasion to conquer the Parthian Empire. He conquers Armenia and then all of Mesopotamia down to the Persian Gulf. Although the Parthian Empire, the ruling elite, is Iranian, they came from really the area around Tehran nowadays, and they have a capital in Iran. More significantly, they're ruled from the city of Ctesiphon near modern Baghdad, and that area is conquered by the Romans. Previously, Trajan, a decade or so earlier, had conquered Dacia, which is to say, roughly modern Romania or part of modern Romania. So he was a conquering emperor. This is the signal. So he begins in the year 115, this conquest of the Parthian Empire. This is the signal for Jews in the West to revolt. And there's a rebellion that begins in northeastern Libya, in Cyrenaica. It spreads to Egypt and then to Cyprus, 3 areas with large Jewish populations. Meanwhile, there is an insurrection in Mesopotamia against the Roman invaders. And we know that prominent in the insurrection are the Jews of Mesopotamia. In fact, the Romans particularly attacked Jewish communities in Mesopotamia to put down this insurgency. So you're the Roman emperor. You've conquered Mesopotamia. You've been hailed as Parthicus, the conqueror of Parthia. And suddenly, it's all dissolving. There is this insurgency. And there is a war in your rear, a serious rebellion led by Jews. It's pretty much a Jewish rebellion in Libya, Egypt, and Cyprus. And you are angry at what is happening. And you are You have one of your best generals attacking and in some cases wiping out Jewish communities in Mesopotamia, and then you send a legion, you divert a legion from fighting in Mesopotamia, you send it to Egypt to put down the revolt. Egypt is a very important place for the Roman Empire. It is the granary of the empire, or one of the granaries, the most important of the granaries, very fertile soil. It feeds Italy and Rome, and the Romans can't possibly allow it to be in the hands of rebels. They put down the revolt with brutality and success. They all but wipe out the Jewish communities of Egypt, Libya, and Cyprus. And for good measure, they engage in repressive measures in Judea as well. We're not really sure of exactly what they did in Judea. Our sources for this rebellion, which is known as the Diaspora Revolt, sometimes known as the Kitos War, after the Roman general Lucius Quietus, who is involved in repressing it in Mesopotamia and ultimately becomes the governor of Judea. But we're not well informed about it at all. It is the most mysterious of the three great rebellions. But it sets the stage, in my opinion, for what happens next. So the Parthians then devote a regular army to fighting the Romans in Mesopotamia, and the Romans are driven out in the year 117. Trajan is itching to reconquer Mesopotamia. He's ready to do it the next year when he has a stroke and he dies over a series of months. His successor is not someone he really thought all that highly of, a young man named Hadrian, of course, one of the most famous of the Roman emperors. And Hadrian's immediate decision is to liquidate the war against Parthia. He considers it a losing proposition, and he announces that the Romans are pulling back to the status quo ante. They're pulling back to their pre-war borders. Instead, he thinks that Trajan has overextended Roman power, and Trajan was unusual among the emperors in trying to do just that. Hadrian is going to devote himself during his reign to beefing up Rome's defenses on the borders. He does that most famously in Hadrian's Wall here in Britain. Oops, so there you see. Okay, so I might as well show you this map. Sorry. So here are the revolts. You can see Cyrene, Alexandria, further south in Egypt, Cyprus, Judea, and these rebellions in Nisibis and Edessa, which were probably led by Jews. And there's a messianic aspect to these revolts. The leaders in Libya and in Cyprus seem to be Messiah figures. I say seem because our sources aren't entirely clear. Okay, so you saw what the Roman Empire looked like under Trajan when it extended to the Persian Gulf. Here's what the Roman Empire looks like under Hadrian. Forget about these conquests to the east. Now, take a step back. What happens next? It's long been known that in the year 130, Hadrian visits Judea and he goes to the ruins of Jerusalem and he announces that he's going to rebuild Jerusalem, but not as a Jewish city. He's going to rebuild it as a pagan city. No temple on the Temple Mount, no temple to the God of Israel. Instead, a temple of Jupiter, various other pagan temples. In town, it's going to look like a Roman city, and the city's going to be named not Jerusalem anymore. It's going to be named Aelia Capitolina. Aelia after the emperor himself, because his name is Aelius Hadrianus, and Capitolina after Jupiter Capitolinus, the chief god of Rome, Jupiter of the Capitoline Hill, the guy to whom Jews have to pay an annual tax. Here is a recreation of what the Temple Mount might have looked like before the Great Revolt. And you see Jerusalem before the Great Revolt. Some of you may have seen this. It now stands in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. This is the Temple Mount as rebuilt by Herod, one of his building projects. And here is a schematic drawing of what Aelia Capitolina would have looked like. So on the Temple Mount, maybe a statue of the emperor, Temple of Jupiter. It looks like any Roman town with a Cardo and a Decumanus, the two main streets. There's a forum. There's a temple of Venus. It stood near where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre stands today. The camp of the 10th Legion, quite possibly in what's now the Armenian quarter of Jerusalem, a hippodrome, theater. We're not really sure what the theater was. Some question about the things there. There are arches, and the main ceremonial gate was the Damascus Gate, and you can still see some ruins of the Roman building there. So, as I said earlier, we know that it's long been known that Hadrian um, Hadrian inaugurates this officially in the year 130. But we now know through archaeology that the rebuilding of Jerusalem as a Roman city, as Aelia Capitolina, begins immediately after the death of Trajan in 117, when Herod comes to the throne. Immediately, they are rebuilding Jerusalem. We know this from the excavations and from the coins that have been found by the excavators. So it is clear to Jews for over a decade that no, the temple is not going to be rebuilt, Jerusalem is not going to be rebuilt, the Romans are there to stay. Now, why does Hadrian want to do it? I think he wants to do it because he is worried about the Parthians. The sources tell us that there is concern about what's going on the Parthian frontier. The Parthians, after all, have won a great victory over the Romans. And they did it in part, I would say, by a proxy war of the Jews in the West. Do we know for a fact that the Parthians got the Jews in the West to revolt at the time when the Romans had invaded the Parthian Empire? We do not know this for a fact. None of our sources tell us this. But it would be in keeping with everything we know about how the ancient Iranian empires worked. Certainly, the previous empire, the Achaemenid Persian Empire, had inspired several Parthian wars among its Greek rivals. And we know that the Parthians were in constant communication with the West, and we know that Jews from Parthia often traveled to Judea, and from Judea they could easily go westward to Egypt. As far as I'm concerned, although I can't prove it, I think we have every reason to believe there was collusion between the rebels in the West and the Parthians and the Jewish insurgents in the East. And so by rebuilding Jerusalem and saying it's a Roman city, he's saying both to the Jews and to the Parthians, don't get any ideas about causing future trouble. Rome is here. We're not going anywhere. We're here to stay. In any case, this inspires a new rebellion, the third of the three revolts I concentrate on in my book, and that is the Bar Kokhba Revolt. The Bar Kokhba Revolt is named after the leader of the rebels, a man named Simon Bar Kokhba, which may refer either to the name of his father, the son of Kokhba, or a son of Kokhba. It might be a place. Bar Kokhba is a pen name, or excuse me, a nom de guerre, a war name, and it means son of a star. This is one of the significations of the Messiah. And Bar Kokhba is recognized by some as the Messiah, most particularly by Rabbi Akiva, perhaps the leading rabbi of the day, the leading Jewish sage of the day. I'd love to know what Bar Kokhba's military background was. I can even imagine him having fought for the Romans earlier in his life. He's certainly a guy who knows a lot about the art of war because he prepares very carefully for this war. And it is clear that he's learned the lessons, of the previous rebellion in Judea, because he's going to fight an insurgency. He's going to fight an irregular warfare against the Romans, as the rebels of 66 did not. He gathers weapons. He prepares caves and other underground shelters for the revolt against the Romans. The revolt seems to be focused in Judea, although there's some evidence of participation in the Galilee, although it's not entirely clear. And when it breaks out in the year 132, it's a shock to the Romans. They're not prepared. This is not unusual. The Romans are almost never prepared for rebellion. The Romans are very arrogant rulers, and they're not really all that interested in what ordinary people under their rule are doing. They always work with the local elites and let the local elites do the heavy lifting as much as possible. But it's quite a shock to the Romans and very successful. Again, we are at the mercy of our sources, which are not good. Better than they were for the Diaspora Revolt, but still not good. But it is clear that the Romans are on the back foot. Perhaps the rebels destroy a legion. Perhaps they kill the governor of Judea. In any case, the Romans are forced to call in reinforcements from the neighboring provinces. And ultimately, in order to put down the revolt, they are forced to call in their best general from Britain, the other end of the empire, with his staff to come help him put down the revolt, which he does slowly, painfully, through a counterinsurgency campaign, going to cave after cave, place after place, and putting down the rebellion systematically. Our best source is a man named Cassius Dio, who was a native Greek-speaking Roman official in the early 3rd century and who wrote an encyclopedic history of Rome based on, no doubt, cribbing from earlier sources. We don't have precisely what he wrote about this period. What we have is a Byzantine abridgment of what he wrote. But although it's very brief, it's actually pretty good and gives us an idea of the kind of painstaking counterinsurgency that the Romans engaged in. We're told that when Hadrian addressed the Senate, he did not use the traditional greeting of the emperor to the Senate, which is to say, I and the army are well, I hope you're well. In addition, he wouldn't say the army was well because the army wasn't well during the Bar Kokhba Revolt. It takes 4 years to put down the rebellion. Bar Kokhba and some of his leaders ultimately make their last stand at a place called Beitar, which you can see on this map. It's about 9 miles away from Jerusalem. It's a well-fortified site. It has not been well excavated. It's in the Palestinian territories on the West Bank, just over the Green Line to the West Bank. But enough has been done there that it is almost certainly, it's an Arab town called Batar, or Batir, excuse me, Batir. It's almost certainly the site of ancient Beitar. There are Talmudic sources that talk about the massive slaughter that took place there. Going back to the pagan Roman sources, some of the church fathers also are useful for this revolt. They also talk about the massive killing that took place. And as you may know, what's really interesting, another thing that's really interesting about this revolt is the sources that we have include letters that were found in caves in the Judean desert. Letters, even including letters from Bar Kokhba to some of the others in the revolt. I should also say that there's archaeological evidence for all 3 of these revolts and numismatic evidence, coin evidence. Really remarkable what we can learn from the coins of the Great Revolt and of the Bar Kokhba Revolt about their ideas, what they thought they were doing, how they thought they were recreating an earlier Jewish state, and how they were serious about their rebellions. But they failed, of course, as you know. Jewish settlement in Judea, well, let's go back here actually for a minute. Jewish settlement in Judea is more or less wiped out. Not entirely. There's still a Jewish population in the city of Lod, for instance, that goes on for centuries. But mostly Jews are driven to the north, to Galilee and Golan, mostly Galilee, That's where Jewish life in the land of Israel survives for the next several centuries and thrives in many ways, though in different ways than it had previously. But many Jewish towns and settlements are destroyed, and there's archaeological evidence in some cases of this destruction. Hadrian continues and goes on to build Aelia Capitolina, which becomes a small but significant city. Caesarea, the Roman capital, is more important. But he does something, again, unusual, unprecedented. He changes the name of the province. Now, it's not unprecedented for the Romans to change the name of a province. They've done that before. But what it is unprecedented is he changed the name of a province as punishment for a revolt. He changes the name of the province from Judea to Syria, Palestina. Hence the name Palestine. I should point out, because it is a hot topic, that this is not the origin of the name Palestine. The name Palestine had been used by non-Jewish sources for centuries. The Greek speakers of this area referred to it as Palestine. Aristotle called it Palestine. Herodotus called it Palestine. An Assyrian source calls it Palestine. And Pliny the Elder also refers to it as Palestine. Jewish sources, by and large, do not. They refer to it as Judea or as Israel. Does it mean it's really Palestine or really Israel? No, it means that there are different groups arguing over what to call it. And the Romans had governed through the Jews or with the Jews in this area, and they had many problems with that, obviously, and ultimately decide after this Bar Kokhba Revolt, we're done. We're now going to govern through the Greeks, and so we will call it Syria Palestina. The story of the revolts. In a large sense, it's over. As I said, the Jews now who are living in this area, they mostly are living in Galilee, and they're hanging on by a thread. It's not at all clear that Jewish settlement will continue here. And what's interesting and unusual is that it does continue, and it continues to resist the Romans, but by and large, it is now spiritual resistance, not physical resistance. The rabbinic movement, which now comes into its own, looks back on the revolts as disasters, as mistakes, as terrible errors that they want to have nothing to do with. Instead, they embrace the Romans. They accept Roman rule. They're deferential to the Romans on the surface. Spiritually, inside, they preach resistance to the Romans and continuation of the traditions and, where possible, the practices of ancient Israel. As you know, around the year 200, their writings are codified, are compiled in the Mishnah, and that leads in several centuries later to the Talmud, both in the Galilee, the so-called Jerusalem Talmud, compiled in Tiberias, and also the Babylonian Talmud, because the Iranian lands are lands of refuge for the Jews, and the Jewish communities there continue and thrive. Well, at the end of my book, I briefly refer to an additional revolt in the 4th century, the so-called Gallus Revolt, which we know very little about, but it's quite fascinating, intriguing from what we know about it. And it is concentrated in the Galilee, we think, but also in Lud, in Lydda, and in this city, Sepphoris, which had been renamed Dio-Caesarea, Zeus Caesar City, and modern Sippori, which was a very prosperous and important town. We know a bit about that in the year 351, 352. And then in the 7th century, the Sasanian Empire, the one that replaces the Parthians, the Sasanians invade the Roman East, including Palestine. They conquer it, and they get Jewish supporters who they allow to return to Aelia Capitolina, Jerusalem, And for a brief period, there are Jews ruling in Jerusalem again. But then the Sasanians decide to withdraw their support. And ultimately, the Byzantines, now ruling in the Roman East, defeat the Sasanians, reconquer Palestine, settle scores, and they're there back there very briefly because in 636 and 638, a new conqueror, the Arabs, emerge and take over in this area. And that brings our story. That's the start of a very different story. So what are the takeaways? And here I shamelessly am advertising my book, The Takeaways. So first, I think that this is an international story, and it's a story of a failed attempt by Jewish rebels to get support from abroad, to get support in particular from the Parthian Empire. The most successful moment is in the Diaspora Revolt in the beginning of the 2nd century, but successful only for the Parthians and only because the Parthians find it in their interest to support, if not even to incite, Jewish rebels against Rome. The Jews of Judea, not for the first time and not for the last time in history, discover that small states small states need larger imperial patrons, but they're also at the mercy of those patrons. From the Roman point of view, we might tend to think, as the title of my book, alas, suggests that this is all about Jews versus Rome or Rome versus Jews. But actually, in the background, always, there are the Parthians. And the Romans are looking at the larger picture. And the Parthian-Roman relation is always a shadow over any Roman-Jewish relations. The second lesson, the second takeaway, I think, and one that I didn't have a chance to concentrate on today, is how fatal disunity can be. If the rebels had any chance of success against Rome, they blew it by their inability to resist the temptation of fighting each other. Unity might have succeeded, or might at least perhaps have caused the Romans to agree to a negotiated peace rather than the horror of the siege and destruction of Jerusalem. But disunity left very little chance of anything other than disaster. And the third point is that there's different kinds of resistance. And where the Jews failed in physical, violent resistance against the Romans, they succeeded in spiritual resistance against the Romans, not without a price, to be sure, over many, many centuries. But resilience succeeded, spiritual resistance and resilience succeeded where physical resistance and resilience failed.